Well, I imagine you are thinking Father Simon has finally taken leave of his senses. Wearing black vestments and odd black vestments, and a little Gregorian chant, a little Latin, well, okay, but do we have to sit through 10 minutes of... Well, C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Screwtape Letters, which I quote entirely too often, says that it is almost always true that in a puritanical age, preachers will preach chastity. And in a licentious age, preachers will preach tolerance. The trick is to teach tolerance to Puritans and to teach chastity to those who do not know it. The vestments I'm wearing are, look in the calendar. If you got your Catholic calendar at home, you can wear black. And this is the traditional vestment. It's called a Roman chasuble or a fiddleback chasuble. One of our altar persons said, "You have no arms." And I said, "Yes, I do. They're..." You see, in the old days, these were so heavy that the old feeble priest couldn't get his arms up to pray, so they just cut the arms off. That's where that comes from. And since you saw the back, you didn't really notice. Now that hymn we sang, the Dies Irae, those of you who are old can remember it well because it was sung at every funeral. It's the sequence for today's feast, but it was also sung at every funeral mass. It was written by a very good friend of dear St. Francis of Assisi. You know, the fellow that you have in your bird bath in the backyard. You know, the one who likes the birds and the animals and all that sort of thing. It was a hymn inspired by the poor man of Assisi. We always think of him as kind of a nice saint. Well, he was pretty grim in his own way. He was always throwing himself naked into thorn bushes and cold rivers. I don't think that's not what the sermon's about. But that hymn was written about 800 years ago, and it's been sung ever since until we decided to get happy in the 60s, when we, you know, that you go to a funeral mostly now and you hear the hymn, "Be Not Afraid." Well, the Dies Irae is be afraid, be very afraid. So that's an element I want to talk about today. And the reason that I'm doing this, that I've gone off my rocker on this, not too long ago I had two funerals, not in this parish. They were, you know, when you've been in a lot of parishes, they keep calling you back because they know you. So this was a few months ago, and one was in the city. And it was the funeral of a child. It was a boy of about 15 or 16 who was killed because of his involvement in gangs. There was no doubt about it. And the other was the funeral of a middle-class, older man, and he died after a full life. The thing that struck me about both funerals were the people who attended the funerals. The kids, you know, for the young man who was killed in a gang fight, they were all his peers, between 15 and 20 years old, all of whom were quite obviously involved in a gang. But at the funeral of the prosperous, aged, well, his accomplished children were there, and their children, you know, from 40 on down. But there was something that tied the two funerals together. When I said things like, "The Lord be with you," the silence was deafening. You could hear the crickets chirp. They barely knew the Our Father. And it struck me that in both cases, so different, there was a common thread. They had never heard the gospel. They'd never heard the gospel. Why had they never heard the gospel? Both sets of parents were wonderful people. One set of parents, because of poverty, had no option but to live in a very bad neighborhood. The other set of parents, well, they lived in a very nice neighborhood. but they were unable to preserve their children from the dishonesty of the world in which they lived. And I cannot tell you how vexed, how upset I am about this as a priest who has a job to do. And I rack my brains. I stay up at night thinking, what happened and what must I do? I think part of the problem is that we have failed not to tell the truth, but to believe the truth. For some reason, or reasons, we have failed to preach the truth of the gospel. These things are true, and they really happened. They are not simply myths that we've composed, or they are not simply suggestions for our life. Christianity is a statement about the nature of reality and how, therefore, we are to live. So, in that spirit, I want to read you from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Paragraph 1033. We cannot be united with God unless we freely choose to love Him. But we cannot love God if we sin gravely against Him, against our neighbors, and against ourselves. He who does not love remains in death. Paragraph 1034. Jesus often speaks of Gehenna, of the unquenchable fire reserved for those who to the end of their lives refuse to believe and be converted, where both soul and body can be lost. Paragraph 1035. The teaching of the Church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Paragraph 1036. The affirmations of sacred Scripture and the teachings of the Church on the subject of hell are a call to responsibility incumbent upon man to make use of his freedom in view of his eternal destiny. His eternal destiny. Paragraph 1037. God predestines no one to go to hell. For this, a willful turning away from God, a mortal sin is necessary, and persistence in it until the end. Paragraph 1038. The resurrection of the dead, of both the just and the unjust, precedes the last judgment. Paragraph 1039. In the presence of Christ, who is truth itself, the truth of each man's relationship with God will be laid bare. The last judgment will reveal even to its furthest consequences the good each person has done or failed to do during his life. Before this, the Church also talks about, in paragraph 1030, all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. But after death they undergo purification, so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. Those few paragraphs in the Catechism are offensive to our generation. They are offensive. Because we do not want to believe that God, who is all good and all loving, could possibly send anyone to hell.